The wind howled through Ashford, Michigan, like some ancient beast clawing at the town's fragile edges. Snow whirled sideways in sheets so thick that the streetlights along Maple Drive looked like dim lanterns swallowed by fog. It was February 14th, 2003, Valentine's Day, and the blizzard had already dumped nearly a foot of powder over Gracie County. From her kitchen window, 72-year-old Margaret Doyle pressed her hand against the frosted glass. Through the curtain of white, she caught sight of Emily Tran, her young neighbor, making her way across the narrow strip of yard that separated their homes. Emily's red parka was the only splash of color in the storm's monochrome fury, her arms curled around a steaming mug. Margaret had loaned it earlier in the evening, the same chipped blue and white ceramic she'd owned for 30 years. Margaret waved from the window. Emily turned, smiling faintly through the gale, her cheeks flushed. Then she was gone, swallowed by the storm. Margaret stepped back from the window, the image of the girl lingering like a photograph burned into her mind. 22, ambitious, steady, the kind of daughter any parent would claim with pride. She never guessed it would be the last time she saw her. Inside the small ranch house she shared with her boyfriend, Jason Alvarez, Emily never arrived. Jason was pacing, one eye on the clock, the other on the snow gathering against the window panes. He'd been expecting her back within minutes. She had promised to return Margaret's mug and come right back. 10 minutes stretched to 20. At half an hour, Jason's chest tightened. By 45 minutes, panic overtook him. He yanked open the front door, cold air knifing in as he stumbled into the storm, calling her name. Emily, M. His boots sank into knee-deep snow as he trudged toward Margaret's place. Margaret answered with worry already etched on her face. She left almost an hour ago, she said, clutching her shawl tighter. I watched her head home. She was fine. Jason felt his stomach drop. He turned back toward their house, shouting until his throat burned, combing the yard, the porch, even the shadowed spaces under the eaves. By the time he burst back inside, snow plastered to his jeans and hair, the house felt unbearably empty. Emily's purse still sat on the counter, her keys beside it. Her textbooks were spread across the dining table, highlighters uncapped, as if she had only stepped away for a moment. The bowl of tomato soup she'd made earlier cooled on the counter, untouched. Her phone buzzed faintly on its charger, everything normal, everything in place, except her. At 10:34 p.m., Jason dialed the sheriff's office with trembling hands. Deputy Frank Wallace, a 22-year veteran, arrived through the storm. His uniform was dusted white, his face creased with exhaustion. The storm had already kept him busy with jackknifed trucks and abandoned cars, but when he stepped into Emily's house, a silence pressed in around him, heavy and strange. Jason paced the living room, voice cracking. She walked in that door, I swear. She never came back, the deadbolt still locked. Look, he rattled the knob. Wallace checked. The deadbolt was engaged from the inside. The back door was secured too, chain still in place. Every window latched tight. Wallace frowned. So you're saying she vanished from a locked house? Jason slammed his hand against the wall. Yes, what else could have happened? The deputy glanced around. Emily's nursing scrubs were draped over a chair. Vanilla candles flickered on the mantel. The air still carried the faint sweetness of her perfume. She was everywhere and yet nowhere. It was the kind of scene that pricked at Wallace's instincts. He'd seen plenty of domestic fights, young people storming out into the night. But this felt different. He couldn't shake the sense that the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. By 11:15 p.m., Wallace radioed in a missing person report. The storm raged outside, blanketing the roads. Searchers would be limited until morning. Jason, frantic, pressed his forehead against the cold window pane. Deputy, you have to do something. She wouldn't just leave. You don't know her. Emily doesn't break promises. Wallace's voice softened, but it carried the weight of hard-earned cynicism. Son, people surprise you, but we'll do what we can. Still, even Wallace admitted to himself it didn't add up. Miles away in Lansing, Maria Tran was preparing for her early shift at the Ford plant when the call came. Jason's voice, hoarse from shouting into the storm, barely formed the words, "Emily's gone." Maria dropped her spoon into her coffee, scattering granules across the counter. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not Emily." She would. By dawn, Maria was barreling down snow-choked highways toward Ashford, tires sliding across ice, knuckles white on the wheel. Every mile deepened the dread in her chest, a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the weather. The next morning revealed the storm's aftermath, pristine white drifts blanketing Ashford, each roof sagging under the weight of snow. Deputies and volunteers gathered with dogs and shovels, trudging through frozen fields. Wallace crouched near the yard, studying the ground. Emily's boot prints were there, distinct waffle patterns, her right foot angled slightly outward from an old basketball injury. They led from Margaret's porch toward her own front door, and then, 10 feet shy of the steps, they stopped. Wallace blinked hard, brushing at the snow as if his eyes deceived him, but the trail ended cleanly, as if she had been plucked out of existence. He straightened, his breath fogging. Behind him, Jason's voice cracked. "What the hell does that mean? Where did she go?" Wallace had no answer, none that made sense in this world anyway. By noon, Maria arrived at the little ranch house. She barely greeted Jason before pushing aside his gaming chair and spreading county maps across the dining table. Her eyes were bloodshot, her jaw set in determination. "I'm not waiting around while they shuffle papers," she told him. "If the sheriff won't fight for Emily, I will." Jason's face was pale, hollowed by guilt and exhaustion. "Maria, I swear I don't know what happened. I was here waiting, that's all." Her gaze cut through him. "Then help me find her. Because until I see her with my own eyes, she's not gone." The house filled with the sound of Maria's pen scratching across the maps, her voice sharp with orders, which roads to canvass, which neighbors to question. Jason watched helplessly, torn between grief and the weight of suspicion already beginning to press on him from every corner of town. Outside, Ashford lay blanketed in silence, the storm's fury spent. But for Emily Tran, that silence was far from peaceful. It was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt every soul in Ashford for years to come. By the time Maria Tran walked through the door of her daughter's small rental house, her body shook with exhaustion, but her mind was lit with fire. The snowstorm had eased overnight, but her drive from Lansing had been grueling. 3 hours of white-knuckled focus on roads the county plows hadn't touched yet. She dropped her coat onto a chair and ignored the deputies who eyed her with a mix of sympathy and irritation. Her gaze swept the room. Emily's purse on the counter, keys beside it, phone charging by the bed. Textbooks spread across the dining room table, yellow highlighters still uncapped. All the tiny proofs of ordinary life halted mid-breath. Maria pressed a hand to her mouth, willing her body not to collapse. Then she forced herself upright, pulled a folded map of Gracie County from her tote bag, and spread it across the dining table. Jason Alvarez, haggard and sleepless, watched her. "Maria, maybe you should sit. You've been driving for hours." She didn't look at him. "Where was the last place you saw her?" His voice cracked. "Here, I told you. She never came back from Margaret's." Maria snapped a red pen cap between her teeth. "Then we start here. Yard, road, ditches, tree line." She didn't just evaporate. Detective Raymond Morrison, the lead investigator, entered with Deputy Wallace at his side. Morrison was a man in his 50s, heavyset, carrying himself with the resigned patience of someone who'd seen too much. "Mrs. Tran," he said, voice low, "I know you're worried, but we've been through this house. No forced entry, no struggle. It's possible Emily stepped out for a moment. Maybe she needed air." Maria's eyes flared. Needed air, in a blizzard, without her keys, her coat, her phone. Morrison exhaled, glancing at Wallace. "Sometimes young people make impulsive choices. Fights with boyfriends, pressure from school." Jason interrupted, his voice rising. "We didn't fight, we had dinner plans, damn it, I was waiting for her." Maria turned on Morrison, sharp as glass. "Don't you dare write her off as some reckless kid. My daughter worked 2 jobs to pay for school. She color-coded her planner. She doesn't run off, she doesn't break promises." Morrison's expression flickered, something between pity and weariness. "Mrs. Tran will follow procedure, but you need to understand resources are thin in this county. Snow like this slows everything." Maria leaned over the table, her finger stabbing at the map. Then I'll do it myself. Every road, every house, every ditch. You can call it procedure. I'll call it love. That afternoon, Maria and Jason trudged door to door, knocking until their knuckles were raw, asking neighbors if they'd seen anything. Most gave polite but unhelpful answers. A few looked away too quickly, muttering about the blizzard and minding their own business. At the third house, an older farmer, Cliff Kowalski, shook his head. Storm was too bad, no one was out. You'll wear yourself down chasing ghosts. Maria's voice trembled with fury. Emily is not a ghost, she's my daughter. Jason reached for her arm, but she shook him off. The anger kept her upright when grief threatened to flatten her. That evening, the community gathered at St. Mark's Church for a vigil. The air smelled of candle wax and wet wool as people whispered prayers. Some offered casseroles, murmured words of comfort. Yet Maria noticed the sidelong glances, the hushed exchanges. Two women in the pew behind her spoke, just low enough to think she couldn't hear. They say Jason had gambling debts, and they were fighting last week, my cousin heard shouting. Maria whipped around, her voice a blade. If you have something to say about my daughter, say it to my face. Don't you dare reduce her to gossip. The room fell silent. Jason stared at the floor, shame pooling in his eyes. Afterward, as they walked to the car, he muttered, "They'll never believe me." No matter what I say. Maria stopped under the glow of a street lamp. Then stop thinking about yourself. This isn't about what people believe, it's about Emily. Do you understand? His shoulders sagged. I do, I don't know how to carry this. Maria looked at him, seeing both his pain and his weakness. You carry it because you must, because she can't. By the third day, Maria began to realize she was fighting two battles, finding her daughter and forcing the system to care. At the sheriff's office, she confronted Morrison again. Expand the search radius, she demanded. Check the river, the farms, abandoned barns. He shook his head. We don't have the manpower, and without evidence of foul play, the state won't allocate resources. Maria's hands trembled on the counter. Evidence, her footprint stop in the snow, detective. Isn't that evidence enough? Morrison leaned back, voice cool. It's strange, yes, but not conclusive. For all we know, she had a plan. People leave. Maria slammed her palm against the desk. The sound echoed through the small station. Not my daughter, not Emily. The room went still. Even Wallace glanced away, embarrassed by Morrison's indifference. That night, Maria lay awake in the small apartment she'd hastily rented in Ashford to remain close to the search. The radiator clanked and hissed, but the cold inside her bones wouldn't leave. She pulled Emily's favorite scarf from her bag, blue with tiny embroidered daisies, and pressed it to her face. Her thoughts spiraled. What if Morrison was right? What if Emily had been hiding something, some secret her mother never saw? But no, that was Emily. She was steady, predictable, good. Maria whispered into the dark, "I'll find you, baby, no matter what it takes." The next morning, she returned to the house with a stack of freshly printed flyers. Jason joined her at the dining table, helping tape them to telephone poles and post office boards. His hands shook as he smoothed the paper, his eyes hollow. "Maria," he said quietly, "what if she's gone? What if she's not coming back?" Maria's chest tightened. She forced herself to look at him, eyes blazing. "Then I'll find out why and who, and I'll never stop until I do." "That's what you don't understand, Jason. Giving up is not an option, not for me, not for her." Jason swallowed hard, nodding, and in that moment Maria realized the storm that had buried the town was nothing compared to the storm inside her. She would move mountains, shatter reputations, and tear down institutions if that's what it took. Emily Tran had vanished into the snow, but Maria Tran refused to let her be forgotten. By the end of the week, Ashford settled into a brittle quiet, the kind that came after plows pushed gray walls of snow to the curb, and people returned to their routines with a new wariness in their eyes. It wasn't silence so much as a held breath, a town mid-sentence. The flyers bearing Emily Tran's face curled against telephone poles, edges damp with melt. Those who knew Emily spoke her name softly, like a prayer. Those who didn't tried not to say it at all. Maria refused to let any of them forget. She started every morning at Rosie's diner with a thermos of gas station coffee and a stack of notes because Rosie, was where the town rehearsed its conscience. Steam fogged the front windows where a painted cardinal perched over the word open, and the bell over the door tinkled each time someone slid inside to shake snow from their boots. "Morning, Mrs. Tran," Rosie said, wiping a booth with swift, practiced swipes. "You want that skillet again? Only if you'll let me tape these next to the pie board," Maria replied, holding up flyers. "People look at your cherry pie like it's the lighthouse at the end of the world." Rosie gave a small smile and nodded. "You do what you need." At the counter, the morning regulars already held court. Earl Patterson, who'd worked county roads since the Nixon years and never retired from having opinions. Dollars Manite, church pianist with elbows sharp enough to puncture rumors, and Hank Brody, whose Sedan feed cap announced he didn't believe in anything he couldn't fix with duct tape or prayer. Earl stirred sugar into his coffee with theatrical vigor. "I'm tellin' you that boy's bad news," he said, nodding vaguely toward nothing and Jason at the same time. "Always had that slick look like a card dealer." Dollars shot him a weary look. "You say that about every man with a haircut. I say it about the ones with debts." Earl leaned closer, lowering his voice without losing volume. "My cousin works the cage out at Coyote Creek Casino. She saw him 3 weekends in a row in December, lost his shirt on blackjack. Man loses money, man makes mistakes." Maria set her thermos down just hard enough to rattle spoons. "My daughter disappeared, Earl, not a coat, not a paycheck." Hank lifted both hands. "Now no one's accusing nobody, we're just talking. Weather warmed up the ugliness around here is all." Maria felt the familiar split inside. One half of her wanted to scream until the formica cracked. The other half knew arguments in diners didn't return daughters. "Then talk about something useful," she said evenly. "Did any of you see a dark pickup on County Road 21 the week before this? No plates in front, salt-eaten bumper. Anyone come to your door selling furnace checks?" Rosie's rag stilled. "We had a man 2 weeks ago," she said slowly. "Said he was with a home energy program out of the state capital. Wanted to look at my ductwork in the basement. Had a badge, kind of official looking, but he wouldn't leave a card. I told him no." Earl frowned. "My neighbor had someone like that, big guy. He had the kind of eyes that never stopped moving." "Did anyone call the sheriff?" Maria asked. Earl's face pinched. "We ain't tattlers in Ashford. We handle things quiet." "That quiet is going to bury us," Maria said. "If Emily met someone who knew the houses around here, who knew when folks were home and when they weren't, then we're not dealing with a fight or a whim. We're dealing with a plan." Across the diner, the bell tinkled. Detective Morrison stepped in, dusted with snow, Deputy Wallace behind him. Conversations dipped, then rose again in a murmur. Morrison's gaze landed on Maria's flyers and then on Maria herself, as if bracing for an impact. "Mrs. Tran," he said, "we're canvassing down by the river today, following the banks as far as the old mill." "With how many?" Maria asked. 3 deputies, 2 volunteers, and a pair of dogs. 3 deputies for a missing young woman whose footprints stop in the snow like God erased her," Maria said. "How generous," Morrison swallowed the retort in his eyes. "We're working every angle, but I'll tell you something we need that we don't have: certainty. We don't know if we're searching for a crime scene, a runaway, or an accident. That changes how we spend bodies and hours." Dollars leaned on the counter. "Detective, forgive me, but if my granddaughter's boots ended 10 feet from her porch, I'd call that certainty." Morrison glanced at Wallace, who stared at the scuffed tile. "We'll keep you updated," Morrison said. "Mrs. Tran, can I see you outside?" They stepped into the biting air. The snow along the curb was a dirty ridge, topped with cigarette butts and a lost mitten. Morrison tucked his chin into his scarf. "I need you to stop confronting folks in public," he said. "You're turning witnesses into enemies." "I'm turning rumors into facts," she said. "People in there know things they don't want to say, and you know it." His voice dropped. "I know this. I've got 12 deputies for 500 square miles. I've got a meth lab bus that won't wait, a domestic I'm checking twice a week, farm equipment showing up missing, and your daughter. If every conversation you start becomes a fight, I lose people who might help me, not hurt me." Maria stared at him, the heat in her chest burning the cold air she breathed. Then earn what you're asking for. Meaning, stop telling me she might have left because she's young. Stop waiting for Emily to call home. Start asking why a stranger knocked on Rosie's, why a dark pickup sat on County 21 in January, why my neighbor keeps seeing the same man at the market parking lot watching the student nurses after their shifts. Morrison blinked. What neighbor? Margaret. She saw a man, tall, gray coat, cap pulled low, talking to a young woman near the Ashford market the first week of February. Not Emily, another nursing student from County General. Did she tell us that? She told a volunteer your deputies sent. He nodded like a bobblehead and said he'd write it down. Maria let out a ragged breath. Check the market cameras. It's 2003, Morrison said softly. Their cameras are fake, dummy domes to scare shoplifters. Maria's jaw tightened until it ached. Then find the student, ask at the hospital. Morrison watched her and something softened behind his eyes, weariness maybe, or reluctant respect. All right, he said finally. We'll ask at the hospital and the energy program. He paused. For what it's worth, I don't think she just walked away. It was something, not enough, but something. By afternoon, Maria was at County General Hospital, sitting across from nurse supervisor Lou-Anne Carpenter in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant. Lou-Anne was mid-40s, competent eyes and a posture that said she'd stood through longer storms than this one. Emily asked me odd questions 2 weeks ago, Lou-Anne said. Wanted to know about reporting requirements, chain of command, what counted as duty to warn. I figured she had a case that rattled her. What kind of case? Maria asked. We had a patient on rotation, young woman with bruises she didn't want to explain. Emily was persistent, wanted to call it in. The woman refused. Lou-Anne's gaze flicked to the window where a nurse hurried by, sneakers squeaking. I told Emily we could flag social services. She said, if something worse happens, I won't be able to live with myself. A fresh weight settled on Maria's shoulders. Did anyone follow her, talk to her outside of work? Lou-Anne hesitated. We had a maintenance supervisor at the hospital, older, quiet, reliable. He's around a lot. People trust him because he fixes things that break. He's harmless. She caught herself. I'm sorry, everyone's harmless until they are. I don't want to feed your fears. What's his name? Maria asked. Robert Doyle, Lou-Anne said. Margaret's nephew, I think. Small town. Everyone's related to someone. Maria kept her face still, but she felt the tremor move through her like an aftershock. Margaret's nephew, helpful Bob. A man who would know schedules, side doors when students finished. The kind of man a town stopped seeing because he'd always been there, tightening bolts and clearing clogs. Did Emily ever talk to him? Maria asked. Everyone talks to Bob. He fixes more than pipes. When Maria left the hospital, dusk was already ringing color from the snowbanks. She parked near the Ashford market, the same lot Margaret had described, and watched the doors swing open, watched the nurses file out in pairs, watched their laughter crystallize in the cold. A store manager came out to salt the slick patch by the curb. He nodded at Maria's flyer on the window and offered a small, apologetic shrug she couldn't read. Her phone buzzed. Jason, where are you? He asked. Following the parts of town that make excuses, she said. A silence then. They called me back to the station, another round of questions. She closed her eyes. Go, answer, be exact, and Jason, stop apologizing for breathing. If you collapse, I have to hold you up, and I'm busy holding up the sky. He exhaled a tired laugh. Yes, ma'am. Maria hung up and watched her breath cloud and fade. The town's secrets didn't arrive as confessions. They leaked like meltwater through old mortar, a false energy inspector. A market conversation no one wanted to own, a maintenance man who knew every door and schedule and story. None of it proved anything yet, all of it felt like gravity. Across Ashford, church bells tolled 6 times. Maria straightened, slid the car into drive, and told herself something she would tell herself 1,000 more times before the truth finally rose from the snow. If the town wouldn't speak, she would make it. If the walls wouldn't crack, she'd bring her own hammer. 2 mornings after Maria heard the name Robert Doyle, the snow along Maple Drive crusted into a hard, glittering rind. What had fallen as softness now held firm like poured concrete, footprints turned to fossil. Deputy Frank Wallace met Maria at the property line with a thermos of coffee and a look that said he'd slept as poorly as she had. "They're sending an estate team," he told her, breath ghosting. "Photographer, scene tech, maybe a meteorology consult. Detective Morrison wants the footprints documented again before the thaw muddles anything." Maria folded her arms against the cold. "They should have done that the first hour." "They did," Wallace said evenly, "but we'll do it again. Sometimes answers show up the second time you look." She went with them anyway. She wasn't watching to learn. She was watching to make sure no one missed what mattered. The yard held the strange geometry that had kept Wallace awake. Emily's boot prints, waffle treads, slightly outward splay on the right set a path from Margaret's porch across the narrow yard toward the steps of Emily's house. Mid-stride, 10 feet from the bottom step, the prints stopped. Not softened, not mudded, stopped, like a line cut in hard chalk. A young state tech crouched, measuring tape pulled taut. "Stride length 2 feet 3 inches, she called. "Depth changes near the end, like she was leaning forward into the wind." Wallace nodded, jotting it down. She was small but strong, played ball in high school, old ankle injury on the right. That's the outward angle you're seeing. "Temperature last night hit 9 degrees, the tech said, standing and flexing her fingers. "Wind gusts up to 28 miles per hour. That could account for some drift." "Not this," Maria said, the words tearing out of her before she could swallow them. "Snow drifts smooth. This is a cutoff." The tech didn't argue, just set a scale marker by the last boot shape and snapped more photos. Morrison arrived while they worked, lips pressed thin under a scarf. "Dogs pick up anything?" he asked Wallace. "Nothing past the last print. They circle, they whine, they sit. It's like a wall they can't find," Wallace said. Morrison grunted. "All right, we widen the ring, check trees, rooftops, gutters, that big maple limb along the property line." He scanned the eaves of Emily's house. "You see a ladder around here. Basement has a rickety one," Wallace said. "Jason said it's been there since they moved in." Morrison turned to Maria. "We'll have to go back through the house, every hinge, every latch." Maria's jaw clicked. "You're telling me you missed something." "I'm telling you I'll look again," he said, and for once his tone held no condescension, only a tired honesty. "Because nothing about this is normal." Inside, the scent of vanilla candles had faded under the tang of cold air and coffee. Morrison moved through the rooms methodically, gloved hands careful. He clicked each window latch, checked screens. He measured the chain lock on the back door, the height of the deadbolt, the clearance under the front door. Wallace followed, taking notes. "Basement," Morrison said. "Let's see it." The basement was a shallow Michigan crawl, poured foundation walls, a laundry sink, and a furnace that rattled like pots on a stove. Jason hovered on the stairs, eyes bruised from lack of sleep. "Look, I already checked down there that night," he said, voice tight. "Twice. There's nowhere to hide." "We're not expecting to find her," Morrison said, not unkindly. "We're trying to find physics." He and Wallace crouched, flashlights cutting cones through the dim. Morrison put his shoulder into a low window, testing the play. "Painted shut," he said. "You'd need a crowbar and a miracle." Wallace pointed to a fine seam of disturbed dust along the sill. "Somebody opened something recent." Morrison frowned, followed the line with his light, and found the origin, the furnace filter, recently changed. He pulled it free, studying the date scrawled in black marker, 1/28/03. "Who changes the filters?" he asked. "Jason does," Jason said. "First of the month, every 2 months actually. The landlord's a cheapskate." Morrison slid the filter back. "All right, nothing here suggests a route out. No hidden door, no break in the foundation. If someone got out after locking both doors, they didn't go through the basement." Maria's voice floated down from the top of the stairs, brittle with impatience. "Then someone never needed to lock them from the outside. Someone was already inside when she came home." Jason flinched. Wallace looked up at Maria, the softness in his expression complicated. "We don't have evidence of a hidden person," he said, "but I can't explain the locks." "Explain Robert Doyle," Maria shot back. "Explain a man who knows every maintenance keypad in the county, who can put a hand on every door and call it his job." Morrison straightened, dust on his knees. We spoke to Mr. Doyle as part of our neighborhood canvass, he said. He was at Margaret's that night. He's her nephew. He brought groceries and checked her heat. He left before 9:30. Ask him where he went, Maria said. Ask him why he's always around the student nurses. Ask him why a fake energy inspector knocks on doors and disappears. Morrison's eyes flickered. We're asking. I promise you we're asking. They reconvened outside. The state tech had finished the grid of photos and now sketched a rough diagram, footprints, the distances to the porch step, the prevailing wind direction noted with arrows. If I had to bet, she said, I'd say someone staged a path, laid boards as they backed away, lifted them with a rope. Wallace winced. On ice, in a whiteout in 20-degree wind, that's circus work. Or, she hesitated. Or they stepped into something, a truck bed, a sled, even a heavy-duty scoop like a skid steer. Who fired up a skid steer in a blizzard without half the block hearing it? Wallace asked. Morrison's gaze had gone distant, like he was staring at something past the house, past the yard. You could park a hospital maintenance truck 3 blocks off, roll in neutral down the grade, coast the corner. Snow would swallow a lot of sound. Maria's breath caught, anger tangling with a cold, precise fear. Hospital, maintenance, a man who fixed things. Stop theorizing and put names to it, she said. We're running out of time for fresh tracks. Morrison nodded once, sharpened. Wallace, get a list of hospital vehicles from County General. Every maintenance log for the last 2 months. Who had what keys, who checked what boilers during the storm, who logged overtime. What about the energy program? Maria asked. I called the state, he said. No door-to-door program in our zip. We're checking contractors. Even if you find the truck, Wallace said softly, we still have the locks. Morrison's mouth thinned. Then we find the person who doesn't need to think about locks because they have keys. Wallace looked toward Margaret's house. The spare, he said quietly. Every old-timer keeps one under a flower pot. Maria felt something inside her slide into a colder gear, less grief, more math. Margaret hides hers under the back porch geranium tub, she said. She told me when she first moved in. It's a habit. Morrison's head turned. Did she tell anyone else? She told Robert, Maria said, because he's family. That evening at the sheriff's office, Morrison spread the newly developed photos across a metal table, harsh fluorescent light flattening everything it touched. Maria stood across from him, fingers skimming the edges. The photos were stark, white field, black squares marking each print, ruler laid alongside. In one frame, Emily's last step looked almost like a reach, heel deep, toe lighter, as if she'd leaned against the wind and expected another inch of ground that never came. Morrison tapped the frame. It bothers me, he murmured. Not the absence, the intention. Whoever did this wasn't lucky. They were deliberate. Maria swallowed, then be deliberate back. He met her eyes. For once they were on the same side of the table. We will, he said. The door opened and Sheriff Patricia Hayes stepped in, mid-50s, iron-gray hair, an expression that could quiet a room. I've authorized overtime, she said simply, and we're bringing in a tracking expert from the state police. I want that yard mapped like a moon landing. Morrison nodded. Wallace let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Maria's shoulders lowered a fraction, relief and fury sharing the same narrow bench. Good, Maria said, because Emily didn't vanish into the sky. She looked down at the photograph of that last impossible step, and for the first time since the blizzard, she let herself admit what the picture demanded. Someone had practiced, someone had planned, and someone who practiced and planned rarely stopped at one. Snow softened into gray slush by the end of the week, and with it, the sharp edges of urgency grew duller. The fresh tire ruts and footprints that had seemed like clues now bled into each other along Maple Drive. Sheriff Hayes's overtime order bought more bodies, more clipboards, more pairs of tired eyes. It didn't buy a miracle. The first sighting came 11 days after Emily vanished. A clerk at a Chevron off 75 in Bay City called the tip line, voice quick and certain. An Asian girl, mid-20s, red coat, exact change for gas and a coffee around midnight. She kept looking over her shoulder. Detective Morrison made the 100-plus mile drive with Deputy Wallace before dawn. Maria insisted on squeezing into the back seat, maps and a spiral notebook on her lap. No one told her no. The Chevron manager rolled back grainy footage on a small CRT monitor that hummed like a beehive. They watched a woman slip into frame under a row of fluorescent bulbs. She was Emily's height, Emily's build. Her coat, though, was navy, not red. The camera angle never caught her face. Zoom, Maria said, leaning so close her breath fogged the glass. The manager shook his head. That's as good as it gets. The clerk, a kid with acne and a Detroit Tigers cap, crossed his heart. It's her, I know faces. Show me her hands, Maria said. They scrubbed back. The woman's fingers counted out bills, slender, careful. The camera bled light across them, nothing conclusive. On the drive back, silence filled the cruiser like heavy water. Finally, Maria said, that wasn't her. Morrison didn't argue. We had to check. Maria pressed her thumb against the seam of her notebook until it hurt. Every time we chase a ghost, we teach the real thing to wait. The calls multiplied. A waitress in Flint swore she'd served a girl who matched the flyer, ordered chicken noodle soup, ate fast, tipped $2 on a $10 check. A bus driver in Saginaw described a quiet passenger who sat near the back and kept her eyes on the aisle. A motel desk clerk in Traverse City remembered someone small and tired paying cash for a room under a first name that was Emily's. Each lead demanded a drive, an interview, a rearranged schedule, and each one ended with the same hollow thud, almost, maybe, not quite. Maria started hating the word resemblance the way people hated the word tumor. Back in Ashford, the town's rumor economy boomed. At the VFW, a group of men decided Jason must have done it because the world made more sense if he had. At First Baptist, Dollars Knight rallied a prayer chain that doubled as a phone tree for organizing searches and casseroles. On a local radio call-in show, people took turns describing what went wrong with America that a girl could vanish on Valentine's Day. Video games, city folks, the coarsening of the culture, snowplows that never came on time. Jason did a second interview at the sheriff's office, then a third. After the fourth, he called Maria from the parking lot, rain spitting at the windshield. They keep asking the same questions, he said, like they're waiting for me to trip. Then don't, Maria said, sharper than she meant to be. Be exact, same story each time. We're not giving the town anything else to feed on. He paused. Do you believe me? The question found soft ground inside her. I believe Emily, she said slowly. I believe who she is. And I believe I don't have the luxury of breaking you apart to see what's inside. I need you standing. Jason swallowed. Okay, then stop listening to the radio, she added, gentler. A new kind of call came from Chicago. A social worker at a homeless shelter said a young woman had enrolled in their program using suspicious ID, said she was from Michigan, had nursing skills, seemed terrified when asked about her past. Morrison's jaw tightened when he relayed it. It's a long shot. We don't get to decide which shots we take, Maria said, already slinging her tote over her shoulder. We take all of them. They made the 6-hour drive in a car thick with stale coffee. Lake effect snow spit sideways across Indiana. Maria watched mile markers tick by and tried not to call Emily's voicemail, which still answered with her daughter's laughing apology for being busy. The shelter sat on a block of red brick row houses with sagging porches and handwritten signs, no loitering, be kind. Inside, a woman in scrubs and sneakers led them to a cramped office where a radiator clicked like an anxious metronome. Elena Vasquez, the social worker said, sliding a file across the desk. Fake ID, yes. Michigan connection, yes. But she's not your Emily. She's complicated. Domestic situation. She's scared of a man who knows how to find people. Maria's hand closed around the edge of the file. Is he in Michigan? Ohio, the social worker said. Last we heard. Morrison's look stopped Maria's next question. They left with a donation receipt and a cardboard cup of weak coffee. On the sidewalk, wind knifed down the street. Maria stared at the salt-streaked curb. We're wasting time. Morrison tucked his chin into his scarf. We're not wasting it. We're spending it wrong sometimes. There's a difference. She hated that he was right. False hopes wore skin. They took the shape of numbers on a caller ID, faces on low-res cameras, receipts with handwriting that could almost be hers. Each one demanded that Maria open her chest to what might be true and then close it around what wasn't. By March, she slept in slices, ate when her hands shook too much to thread another flyer through another staple. Sheriff Hayes quietly reassigned 2 deputies to other cases. "We have to keep the lights on," she told Morrison. He nodded because budgets didn't care about grief. At a Monday town meeting in the high school gym, metal chairs, fluorescent hum, coffee in giant urns, a man Maria didn't know stood and said the thing on some minds. "Why should we keep spending on this?" he said, gesturing broadly, when it's probably what it always is. Boyfriend snaps, she runs, or she comes back and says she needed space. "I'm not heartless," he added, as if the disclaimer made it true. Maria rose before the moderator could swallow the moment. "My daughter is not a statistic you slot into your comfort," she said, voice steady enough to frighten herself. "She is a person. She is a person who studied late, color-coded her binder, brought soup to neighbors with the flu, and asked hard questions when a patient showed up with bruises. If that makes her inconvenient, I don't care. She matters." A hush fell. For a flicker, she felt the room lean toward her in sympathy or shame or simply attention. Then Earl Patterson stood, old grievances in his eyes. "We all care, Mrs. Tran, but we also got farms to run and kids to feed. Sheriff's got other work. This ain't Detroit. We can't treat this like TV." Murmurs of agreement. Morrison watched Maria, ready to intervene. She beat him to the microphone. "You want to talk about work," she said. "I'll trade you shifts. I'll clock into your dairy at 4 a.m. And you come knock on doors until your knuckles bleed. Then you come home and sleep on a couch you hate because it's next to the phone, and when it rings you leap like a soldier under fire, and then it's a wrong number asking about a warranty. Then you look me in the eye and tell me we can't act like my daughter's life is television." Silence, deeper this time. Sheriff Hayes finally rose, voice a calm plow through the drift. "We're continuing the investigation, period. If you want to help, sign the volunteer sheets. If you want to complain, file it with me. Mrs. Tran is doing what any mother would do." After, in the parking lot, Morrison caught up to Maria as she leaned against her car, the cold seeping through her coat into bone. "You were good in there," he said. "You were also a hair from burning down the gym." "Maybe I should have," she said, teeth chattering, not entirely from the cold. He hesitated. "We talked to Robert Doyle again." Maria looked up sharp and, "He's steady, cooperative, says he left Margaret's before 9:30, says he went home to watch the late forecast. He volunteers for searches. He brings donuts." "Donuts don't cancel keys," she said. "Ask him where he was the first week of February, the day Margaret saw a man in a gray coat at the market watching the nurses." "We're working the hospital angle," Morrison said. "Maintenance logs, vehicle records, overtime slips. It's slower than you want because it's older than paper, and because people like him live in the seams of places. They're invisible until they are. Then make him visible," she said. "Drag him into light." Morrison gave a humorless smile. "The law is not a floodlight, Maria. It's a flashlight with dying batteries on a windy night." She stared at him, then cupped your hand around it. The worst call arrived just before midnight 3 days later. A woman at a bar in Toledo swore she'd just met Emily. She bought her a drink, listened to a story about nursing school, heard the name Jason. Maria and Jason drove through sleet and the kind of quiet that hurts. The bar smelled of fryer oil and old beer. The womankind eyes, hands shaking, pointed to a corner booth. "She was right there," she said. "I wouldn't lie." The security camera above the ATM had a clean angle. The manager rewound. A woman sat alone in the booth, hair pulled back, profile turned toward the room. She could be Emily, she could be anyone. The woman turned to laugh at something the bartender said. For 1 second, the camera caught the line of her face full on. Maria stopped breathing. It was Emily. Back in the parking lot, snow pecked at the windshield. Jason slapped the steering wheel once hard, as if he could beat fate into submission. Maria stared straight ahead. "Thank you for driving," she said softly. Jason nodded, jaw tight. "I'll keep driving," he said, "wherever you point." She closed her eyes, felt the snap of something inside, like a branch under too much ice. Dead ends were supposed to be lines on maps. Instead, they were rooms you lived in. She opened her eyes, found the handle of her resolve, and pulled. Tomorrow, she said, we stop chasing stories that have no names. Tomorrow we name them: the market, the hospital, the trucks, the keys, the gray coat, and we stop letting this town call him harmless. She didn't say his name, not yet. Names had to be earned in the mouth of the truth. Above them, the parking lot light hummed and flickered. Sleet turned to snow. Somewhere in Ashford, a man everyone trusted set out donuts for a morning search he knew would find nothing. By 2005, 2.5 years after Emily Tran vanished, the flyers on telephone poles had faded to ghostly outlines. People still whispered her name in Ashford, but more like an unsolved riddle than an open wound. Maria stayed in town, refusing to return to Lansing, though her savings were gone, and she worked nights cleaning offices just to keep the one-bedroom apartment she'd rented near Maple Drive. Detective James, Jimmy, Sullivan arrived that fall, transferred from the Michigan State Police to the quieter pace of Gracie County. At 42, he was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair already salted at the temples. He had the worn look of a man who'd seen too many bodies in alleys and too many juries shrug at truth. 2 divorces and a drinking problem trailed him like shadows. He told Sheriff Hayes he was ready for small-town work: farm thefts, bar fights, maybe the occasional meth lab bust. "I've had my fill of ghosts," he said, but ghosts had other plans. During his first week, Sullivan wandered into the evidence room in the basement of the sheriff's office. There, stacked in boxes labeled Tran, Emily 2003, he found binders of transcripts, fingerprint sheets, and photographs sealed in plastic. The crime scene images caught him first: the trail of footprints ending abruptly in a pristine snowfield, the close-ups of the boot tread, the stark stillness of a young woman's bedroom, soup cooling on the counter. He told himself he was just orienting, brushing up on unsolveds. But that night, long after the office lights clicked off, Sullivan was still at the metal table under a single buzzing lamp, flipping through witness statements until the pages felt soft. Maria heard about him the way she heard about everything in Ashford, through whispers at Rosie's diner. New detective from Detroit. "Looks like he's carrying a mountain," Dollars Manite told her, stirring sugar into her tea. When Maria first met him, she didn't soften her stance. She learned not to. She found him in the hallway of the sheriff's office, leafing through her daughter's file like it belonged to him. "You're Sullivan?" she asked. He looked up, surprised at the force in her voice. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped closer. "Don't tell me you're just looking things over. I've buried that line too many times. If you're taking her case, you don't get to walk away when it gets heavy." Sullivan set the file down carefully. "I don't walk easy," he said, "and I don't like unfinished stories." Maria studied him for a long moment, measuring whether he was another man who would placate her or someone willing to blade with her. "Then you'd better understand something," she said. "I've been fighting this town, the sheriff's budget, and God himself for 2 years. If you're stepping in, you're either with me or you're another wall I'll break." He gave the faintest smile. "Walls don't last long with you, do they?" Over the next weeks, Sullivan re-interviewed key witnesses. Margaret Doyle's memory hadn't shifted an inch. She still swore she'd watched Emily walk into the storm that night. Jason Alvarez, now back in Grand Rapids, answered Sullivan's questions with weary patience, the same story he'd told 20 times. Maria sat in on some interviews, watching Sullivan's style. He didn't bulldoze. He circled slow and steady, letting silence do the work until people said more than they intended. Still, the obstacles mounted. Sheriff Hayes pulled him aside one afternoon. "Jimmy, I brought you here because you know homicides, but I also need you to cover break-ins, overdoses, farm thefts. This case, it's a graveyard. Morrison nearly lost his marriage chasing it. I don't want to lose you too." Sullivan folded his arms. "With respect, Sheriff, if I stop digging, I'm already lost." Her sigh echoed the fatigue of 2 decades in uniform. "Then keep digging, but don't drown." At night, Sullivan's rented duplex in Ithaca transformed into a shrine. He thumbtacked crime scene photos across the spare bedroom wall. Emily's boots frozen mid-stride, the kitchen counter with soup bowl untouched, Maria's maps with her furious red pen marks. He built timelines, cross-referenced vehicle logs, and printed hospital staff rosters. His refrigerator filled with takeout cartons, his bed with cold files. Maria stopped by one evening bringing a grocery bag of home-cooked pho because she'd learned Sullivan wasn't eating. She stood in his makeshift war room, staring at her daughter's life dissected and ordered into neat columns. "You've built a coffin out of paper," she whispered. Sullivan looked at her, his face lined with sleeplessness. "Or a ladder," he said, "depending which way you climb." She pressed the bag into his hands. "Eat first, then climb." The townsfolk noticed Sullivan, too. Earl Patterson muttered at the diner, "That city cop's got crazy eyes, stays up all night staring at snow from 03. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, Ashford needed a little crazy to find the truth, but even Maria grew worried. One night she found him parked across from the Ashford market, watching the lot where Margaret had once seen the man in the gray coat. He'd been there for hours, binoculars on the passenger seat. "Jimmy," she said through his rolled-down window, "if you burn yourself to the bone, who's left to fight with me?" He rubbed his temples. "I don't know how to turn it off." She looked at him with a mixture of pity and defiance. "Then don't turn it off, but learn how to carry it without letting it drown you. Emily needs a detective, not another ghost." For the first time in years, Maria saw the faintest glimmer of hope in herself, in his obsession, yes, but also in the way he listened when no one else did. By winter 2006, the investigation had grown colder still. But Sullivan stayed locked on Emily's case like a compass that refused to point anywhere else. His colleagues muttered about his Emily wall, about missed court dates and reports scribbled last minute. Yet Maria knew, if anyone could wrestle answers from the frozen silence that had swallowed her daughter, it was the detective who'd walked into Ashford claiming he was done with ghosts, only to let one claim him completely. And as snow began to fall again that February, eerily like the night Emily disappeared, Maria stood at her window, watching flakes blur the streetlights, and whispered to herself, "Maybe this storm brings her home." By 2019, 16 years had passed since Emily Tran's footprints ended in the snow. The case lived in the basement of the Gracie County Sheriff's Office, where evidence boxes sagged on metal shelves and the air smelled of mildew and paper dust. For most, Emily's file was an artifact, something young deputies were told about on their first week, like a local legend. But for Detective Jimmy Sullivan, it was still oxygen. On the morning of March 15, 2019, he sat hunched over petty cash receipts from an embezzlement case when the phone on his desk rang. He answered absently, half expecting it to be a clerk with another question about signatures. Instead, a woman's voice said, "Detective Sullivan, this is Dr. Angela Martinez at the Michigan State Police Lab. I think you'll want to sit down." She explained that her team had been retesting old cold case evidence with advanced DNA extraction methods. In Emily's file, they'd found cotton blend fibers collected from the lining of her red winter coat. Back in 2003, the fibers hadn't produced a usable profile, but now, 16 years later, the technology had caught up. "We were able to extract 13 genetic markers," Dr. Martinez said. "It's a partial profile, but strong enough for comparison. The sample is male." Sullivan's pen stilled over his notepad, his pulse thudded in his ears. "Male," he repeated. "Yes, and there's more," she added. "We detected trace amounts of a commercial-grade soap residue, the kind used in hospitals, schools, or government facilities, not household." Sullivan leaned back, his chair creaking under him. For years, he'd turned over every theory, every timeline, until his own mind blurred. Now, out of a sliver of fabric, the past was talking back. His hand shook as he wrote the words, "DNA, male, soap, institutional." "Doctor," he said, his voice low, "you may have just lit a fire in a graveyard." That night, Sullivan didn't go home. Instead, he spread every transcript, photo, and logbook across the sheriff's conference room table. He poured coffee until his hands trembled. The snow had begun again outside, drifting against the windows as if mocking him with its repetition. Maria Tran arrived at dawn, called in by his urgent message. She found him with his sleeves rolled, tie loosened, eyes red. "What happened?" she demanded, setting her tote bag on the chair. "DNA," he said simply. For the first time in years, her body reacted before her mind. She had to grip the back of the chair to steady herself. Whose? Not hers, male, from fibers on her coat and soap residue industrial. Think hospitals, schools, places like that. Maria blinked fast, tears threatening. She was in nursing rotations. "County General," he nodded. Every maintenance worker, every orderly, every staffer she brushed against in those last weeks is back in play, 16 years later. She exhaled, half a laugh, half a sob. "Jimmy, do you realize what this means?" He did, but he also knew the danger. DNA was a compass, not a map. It pointed but didn't carry you. Sullivan built a new list. He digitized every old witness statement, cross-referenced with employment records from 2003. Custodians, technicians, drivers, orderlies, anyone connected to County General or the medical supply company where Emily had worked part-time. 13 names surfaced. Maria looked over his shoulder as he highlighted them one by one. "That's it. 13 is enough," Sullivan said. "Getting samples is the hard part. People don't line up to hand over their DNA." He started with voluntary requests. 8 cooperated. One after another, the lab eliminated them. 3 more couldn't be located, dead, moved out of state, records gone. That left 2. The first refused flat out, citing lawyers and civil rights. Sullivan tried shadowing him, waiting for discarded coffee cups or cigarette butts. Nothing stuck. The second was a name Maria recognized instantly when Sullivan circled it on his yellow pad: Robert Doyle, Margaret's nephew. The man who had fetched groceries for his aunt during the storm, who joined the earliest search parties, who'd brought coffee and donuts for volunteers while Emily's mother combed ditches. Maria's lips thinned. He was there. He was in Margaret's kitchen that night. Sullivan looked at her, his jaw tightening, and he worked maintenance at County General for 20 years. The surveillance became Sullivan's new ritual. He parked across from Robert Doyle's small house on Maple Street, watched him leave for the hospital at 6:00 a.m., return at 3:30 p.m., curtains always half closed. From the garbage bins he retrieved whiskey bottles, new, unusual. He noted the daily visits Doyle made to his aunt's grave, where his shoulders shook with quiet sobs. When Sullivan finally requested a voluntary DNA sample, Doyle agreed. His demeanor was calm, even cooperative, but Sullivan's gut tightened when the man's hands trembled slightly as he signed the consent form. 2 weeks later, Dr. Martinez called again. "Detective," she said, her voice tight with excitement, "we have a full match, all 13 markers. It's Robert Doyle." Sullivan sat very still at his desk. He stared at the computer screen where his notes glowed. Robert Doyle, harmless. The word mocked him now. Maria met him that evening at Rosie's diner, where the world had once tried to forget Emily. Sullivan slid into the booth, the match report in his folder. "It's him," he said. "Robert Doyle." Maria's hand froze on her coffee cup. "Say it again." "DNA doesn't lie." He touched her coat. "Soap traces match his work. He was in the right place at the right time with the right access." For a long moment, Maria said nothing. Her jaw trembled, her knuckles white around the cup. Finally, she whispered, "All these years he was walking among us, bringing donuts, smiling, comforting." Sullivan nodded grimly, and hiding. Maria leaned forward, fire in her eyes. "Then drag him out. No more ghosts, Jimmy. We put a name to the storm." The next step would not be simple. DNA was a thread, but they needed the whole rope: testimony, corroboration, evidence of means. Sullivan knew Doyle was cracking. He saw it in the way the man fumbled his keys, in the increased whiskey bottles, in the nervous trips to his aunt's grave. But time mattered. If Doyle suspected they had him, he could bolt, or worse, destroy what remained of Emily's truth. For Sullivan, it was no longer just a case. It was a reckoning 16 winters overdue. And for Maria, it was proof that her war had not been madness. The man who'd hidden behind helpfulness was finally visible in the light. The storm had spoken. Detective Jimmy Sullivan knew timing was everything. A direct confrontation with Robert Doyle without enough weight behind it could spook him, send him running, send him deeper into silence. But wait too long, and Doyle might decide to vanish into some distant county or bury the last pieces of evidence forever. So Sullivan started slow. On April 15, 2019, he walked into County General's maintenance office carrying a manila folder and a calm face. Doyle was at his desk, tool belt slung over the back of a chair, clipboard stacked with work orders. To the hospital staff, he was reliable Bob, the quiet man who fixed leaks and boilers without complaint. "Mr. Doyle," Sullivan said evenly, "thanks for sitting down." Just part of a cold case review. Doyle looked up with practiced composure. His hair had thinned, his face lined, but his smile was the same kind Maria remembered from church suppers. "Of course, detective, anything I can do." They sat in a small office near the boiler room, walls lined with rust-colored pipes. The place smelled of metal and industrial soap. "I've been going back through the Emily Tran case," Sullivan began. 16 years is a long time. We're updating interviews, making sure no stone was left unturned." Doyle nodded, folding his hands neatly on the table. "Terrible thing. Still think about that girl, my aunt. She prayed for her every night." Sullivan leaned back, watching. "Where were you that night again?" Doyle repeated the same story he'd given in 2003. Groceries for his aunt, checked her furnace, left before 9:30. Went home, watched the weather report, but Sullivan noticed the tiny cracks. Doyle's breathing was shallow, too quick. His hands stayed clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened, as though he was holding them down. And every few seconds his eyes darted toward the office door, his escape hatch. Sullivan pressed just a little. "Funny thing about cold cases," he said, flipping open the folder. "Science changes, new forensic techniques, new ways to see old evidence." A flicker crossed Doyle's face, almost imperceptible, but Sullivan caught it. "What kind of techniques?" Doyle asked, voice thin. "Oh, all kinds," Sullivan said casually. "Fibers, trace chemicals, DNA. You'd be surprised what sticks around on a coat for 16 years. For the first time, Doyle's voice quavered. You think you found something?" Sullivan smiled just enough. "I know we did." 3 days later, April 18, Sullivan called him back for a second interview. This time in the sheriff's office, neutral territory stripped of comforting pipes and familiar smells. Doyle sat stiff in the chair. His face had paled, his lips dry. Sullivan didn't push right away. He let silence do the work, stacking papers deliberately as if building a wall brick by brick. Finally, he slid one photo across the table. Emily's coat fibers magnified under a lab scope. "You see, Bob, DNA doesn't care how careful you think you were. It remembers, it holds on." Doyle swallowed hard. His hand trembled as he reached for a styrofoam cup of water. His attempt at composure cracked when the cup slipped slightly, water splashing onto the table. You're saying my DNA?" His voice was almost a whisper. Sullivan didn't answer. He let the silence suffocate. Doyle stood abruptly, muttered something about the restroom. Through the thin wall, Sullivan heard him vomiting. When Doyle returned, his face was ashen. He tried to compose himself, but the mask no longer fit. The third interview came on April 22. Sullivan decided this was the moment. He sat across from Doyle in a dim interrogation room, hands folded, voice steady. The profile came back. 13 markers, it's a perfect match. Robert Doyle, it's you." The words hung like lead in the air. Doyle's whole body began to shake. His breathing grew ragged, his skin a gray pallor. For a moment, Sullivan thought he might collapse. Instead, Doyle pressed his palms flat on the table and whispered, "I never meant for it to happen the way it did." Sullivan leaned forward. "Tell me." The confession came in fragments, torn between sobs and silence. Doyle admitted following Emily from his aunt's house using Margaret's spare key. He claimed he only wanted to talk, that he'd been drinking, that he felt drawn to her. When she resisted, he said, things turned physical. "She hit her head on the counter," Doyle murmured. I swear it was an accident. She was a sweet girl." "Didn't deserve," his words dissolved into a sob. Sullivan's jaw clenched. "And then you staged the scene, the footprints, the locks." Doyle nodded, trembling. I watched those crime shows, thought I was smarter. I locked the doors from inside, slipped out the basement window, wiped it down, covered my own tracks with boards, ropes. I thought it would look impossible, like she vanished. "Where is she, Bob?" Sullivan's voice cracked, anger and grief converging. "Where's Emily?" Doyle closed his eyes. "Somewhere she can rest, by the water, where the old oak watches." Sullivan slammed his fist on the table, startling him. "That's not an answer. Give me the damn place." But Doyle only wept, rocking in his chair. When the arrest came 2 days later, Ashford erupted. The news spread faster than fire in dry grass. Robert Doyle, the handyman, the church usher, the devoted nephew, was Emily Tran's killer. At Rosie's diner, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Earl Patterson muttered, "I always knew he was off." Dolersma Knight, who had defended Doyle for years, put her head in her hands. Jason Alvarez, now remarried with 2 children, heard the news from his sister in Grand Rapids. His knees buckled, tears falling before he could catch them. For 16 years he had carried the weight of suspicion, whispers that he was the one who snapped. Now, finally, he was free, but freedom didn't erase 16 years of doubt. Maria, when Sullivan told her, stood so still he thought she hadn't heard. Then her body convulsed with sobs so deep they seemed to come from her bones. "All these years," she whispered, "he brought donuts, he prayed with me, and all this time," she couldn't finish. Sullivan put a hand gently on her shoulder. "We have him, but we're not done until we bring Emily home." The facade had cracked wide open. Doyle was no longer the harmless handyman, but a man undone by the very secrets he'd built his life on. Yet even in his confession, the most vital truth remained hidden, the exact place where Emily lay. For Sullivan, the chase wasn't over. For Maria, the grief was sharper than ever. The killer had a name, but Emily was still missing, and a mother's war was not finished until her daughter was found. The morning after Robert Doyle's arrest, Ashford awoke to a kind of silence the town hadn't known in years. It wasn't the hush of snowstorms or the routine quiet of farm dawns. It was a silence of shame. At Rosie's diner, where Emily's name had been passed around like gossip, the regulars stared into their coffee cups. The television above the counter replayed the press conference. Sheriff Hayes announcing charges of murder, Sullivan's stiff silhouette beside her, and Doyle's mugshot, eyes hollow, hair limp, mouth twisted into something that looked more pathetic than sinister. "He was at church every Sunday," Dolersma Knight whispered, clutching her rosary. "He held babies at baptisms." Earl Patterson slammed his palm against the counter. "Don't look at me like I trusted him. I said from the start he was wrong." Rosie cut in sharply. "You said Jason was wrong, Earl, week after week. Don't rewrite your memory now." The diner quieted. For once, no one argued. Jason Alvarez learned of Doyle's arrest from his sister in Grand Rapids, who called him sobbing. He sat on the edge of his bed, his wife watching him carefully, their 2 children asleep down the hall. "So it wasn't you," his sister kept repeating. "It was never you." Jason hung up, buried his face in his hands. His wife, Clara, touched his shoulder. "You should feel relieved," she whispered. "I don't," Jason said, his voice raw. "I feel robbed. 16 years of people looking at me sideways, of losing friends, of wondering if I was crazy enough to believe them. I get vindication now, when Emily's in the ground somewhere." He pressed his palms against his eyes until sparks danced. "There's no getting those years back." For Maria, the news struck like a blade. Sullivan had called her at 6 a.m. "It's him. The DNA is a perfect match." He confessed. Maria stood in her kitchen, clutching the counter until her knuckles blanched. Her voice broke. "And Emily, he says he put her by water, near an oak. We're pressing for the location." Maria's sobs came jagged, louder than she wanted, enough that the neighbors must have heard. When she finally spoke, it was through the rattle of grief and rage. "He brought me coffee," she whispered. "That man sat in my living room, said prayers over my daughter, and all the while he knew." Sullivan didn't try to answer. He simply said, "I promise we will find her." The community's reckoning came fast. At the hardware store, customers who had relied on Doyle for repairs now traded stories about how strange he'd always been, as if distance could absolve their blindness. At First Baptist, the pastor faltered through a sermon about wolves in sheep's clothing, while Margaret Doyle, frail and half lost to dementia, sobbed in the front pew, repeating her nephew's name over and over. In the grocery aisles, people stopped Maria with trembling hands on her arm. "We're so sorry," they said. "We never knew." She forced herself to look them in the eye. "That's the problem." None of us wanted to know, but the sharpest confrontation came in the sheriff's office. Jason, pale with exhaustion, approached Maria as she waited outside Sullivan's office. "They all think I should be happy now," he said, his voice shaking. "That I'm free, but I'm not. I'll never be free. You won't either." Maria studied him. For years she had harbored doubts, small, poisonous seeds planted by gossip. She saw now the toll they had taken on him. "I was cruel to you," she admitted softly. "I wanted someone to blame, and you were closest." Jason's throat worked. "I loved her. That's the part nobody ever believed." Maria reached for his hand, squeezing it once. "I believe you now, but believing won't bring her back." His eyes glistened. "No, but maybe it'll let me breathe again." That night Maria stood at Emily's memorial cross on Maple Drive, candles guttering in the spring wind. She thought of the neighbors who had whispered, the detectives who had doubted, the man who had smiled as he deceived them all. Doyle's arrest was not the end. It was only the tearing away of the last illusion. And in that tearing, Maria understood. Finding the truth was not the same as finding peace. Emily was still gone, the town was still broken, and the hardest part of her war was just beginning, the fight to bring her daughter home. The trial of Robert Doyle began in the fall of 2020, in a courthouse that smelled of varnish and dust, where fluorescent lights hummed above a jury of 12 citizens who wished they were anywhere else. Emily Tran sat in the front row every day, Emily's scarf folded neatly in her lap, her face set like stone. Behind her, townspeople filled the benches, some hungry for justice, others desperate to see their own guilt absolved. The prosecution laid it bare, the DNA on Emily's coat, the commercial soap trace, Doyle's fragmented confession. They showed jurors the photographs of her last boot prints, ending in snow like punctuation on a life. Doyle's defense called it a tragic accident. His lawyer's voice rang with practiced sympathy. He panicked. He staged the scene out of fear. He is guilty of poor judgment, but not premeditated murder. Maria clenched the scarf until her fingers ached. In her mind, she heard Doyle's whisper from Sullivan's notes. "She was such a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what I did." During cross-examination, Sullivan himself testified, his voice measured but heavy. "Mr. Doyle didn't just panic," he told the jury. "He calculated. He manipulated a crime scene to make it look impossible. That is not fear, that is control." When Doyle finally took the stand, his mask slipped. He wept, begged for forgiveness, mumbled half-truths about temptation and loneliness. He never once said Emily's name. Maria stood in the hallway after, surrounded by reporters shoving microphones. One asked, "Do you feel sympathy for him?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Sympathy? He stole my daughter, buried her where I still can't find her, and ate donuts with us while we searched. Don't ask me about sympathy. Ask me about justice." The jury deliberated 2 days. On the third, they filed in faces blank. The foreman spoke the word Maria had been waiting 16 years to hear: guilty. She closed her eyes, not in relief but in exhaustion. Around her, people gasped, some wept, some whispered. Jason Alvarez, sitting quietly in the back, pressed his fists against his knees until his knuckles turned white. Vindication carried no joy. The judge sentenced Doyle to life without parole. He would die in a prison cell, his tools replaced with bars, his helpful facade stripped away. But even victory had sharp edges. After the verdict, Sullivan found Maria standing outside the courthouse, staring at the bronze statue of blindfolded justice. The October wind whipped her coat. "You got your verdict," he said gently. Maria's eyes filled but didn't spill. Verdict is Emily. Verdict isn't her laugh or her soup cooling on the counter. Verdict is the least bitter thing left on the table. Sullivan swallowed, his own throat raw. "You fought until the end, that matters." She turned to him, voice breaking. "Then why does it feel like losing?" He didn't answer. He knew better. Years later, townspeople would tell the story differently. Some would say it proved evil hides in plain sight, others that it showed a mother's will can outlast a storm. But for Maria, there was only one truth. Emily's footprint still ended in snow, her body never found. And so each year on February 14th, Maria placed fresh flowers at the memorial cross and whispered into the cold air, "I didn't stop, baby, I never stopped," because justice had come, but peace never had.